Okay, we can hear me okay, I think. Okay. Hi, everyone. Like Valerio said, my name is Marlene. And yes, today I'm going to be speaking to you about the topic of transcendence and the power of representation. So the word transcendence is not a word that we are hearing every day. There was a movie a few years ago called Transcendence with Johnny Depp in it. It was a very creepy movie. Would not recommend, actually. But I'm not sure if anyone liked the movie. I don't know. But hopefully, as I continue this talk, you'll get a better understanding of why I decided to use this word, transcendence, to describe the power of representation. So before we get started, I'll just share again a little bit more about me. I'm from Harare, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country in the southern part of Africa. It's just above South Africa. It's a very interesting place, Zimbabwe. We had a coup a couple of years ago. The military came on the TV and they said, we have the president. And so that was interesting. But there are other things in Zimbabwe, like Victoria Falls, that are very nice and not as controversial. And it's a really great place for tourism and animals and things like that. So if you are ever thinking of visiting Africa, I can recommend it when there's no coup happening. So something else about me is that I work for a company called Voltron Data, and we do a lot of things with developer advocacy. I'm a developer advocate. We do a lot of things with Apache Arrow. And there are a couple of people actually here at the conference from Voltron Data. So there they are, actually. Shout out to the team from Voltron, exactly. And we work remotely from different parts of the world, so it's been nice to see them here in person. And like Valerio mentioned, I am the previous vice chair of the PSF, and I founded an organization called Zimbabwean that gets women in Zimbabwe excited about coding in Python. So getting into the talk now, when we have this idea of transcendence, I think a good place to start to understand what it means is looking at the world of sports. So I'm going to just play a quick video clip for us to help us understand what transcendence means. Let's hope that plays. Okay. Interesting. So this was a clip on the screen from the UK, and this is a scene where people are watching football. I'm going to explicitly say football because I said soccer at another European conference, and people were very offended. So I'm going to say football. Anyway, the football that happens in Europe is actually very popular all around the world, even in Zimbabwe. I remember growing up, I'm not a very big fan of football, but my brothers would be like randomly shouting like AC Milan or FC Barcelona or something like that. So these scenes that we just saw on the screen are something that happens in a lot of different countries. And so as I've grown up, I mentioned I'm not a big fan myself of football, but whenever I saw scenes like this, I would ask the question, what exactly is going on here? Like, why are these people being so emotional about what's going on, the football itself? Well, this is actually something that has been studied by a number of different institutes across the years. Nope. Second screen. So a few years ago, the New York Times published an article titled "Sports Psychology, It Isn't Just a Game." And researchers from this article found that many fans, while they're watching a game that they're interested, become so tied to their teams that they experience hormonal surges in the same way or just as much as the athletes playing in the games did. So this quote from the article is by a professor called Robert Cialdini, and he says, "Our sports heroes are our warriors. This is not some light diversion to be enjoyed for its inherent grace and harmony. The self is centrally involved in the outcome of the event. Whoever you root for represents you." And another professor from this article is quoted, and he says, "The results suggest that fans empathize with the competitors to such a degree that they mentally project themselves into the game and experience the same hormonal surges that the athletes do." So I think this is super fascinating to me. And here we have this human experience where just by watching someone who inspires us, we can transcend our physical bodies and mentally project ourselves, and we can start to experience these hormonal changes in the same ways that athletes do. So I think this is just incredible. And when I was reflecting on this a bit more myself, I tried to think where I've personally experienced this feeling of transcendence. So I actually thought about this woman. Does anyone know Serena Williams in the house today? You know, Serena's amazing. And she recently retired from tennis, so that was devastating news for me. But she had such an amazing career, and when I was growing up, my dad was actually very into tennis. And I clearly remember this one morning where we were all sitting together. We would sometimes on Sundays come together, and we would sit together and watch the tennis matches. And so Serena was playing at Wimbledon that day. And I remember being so nervous for her. She was about to hope, I really wanted her to win the finals. And I think with every stroke she was doing, my breath was held and I had adrenaline pumping through me. And ultimately she won that game. And at the end of that, I thought to myself, actually, I am Serena Williams myself. I pretty much look exactly like her. And all I need to do is just work a little harder, and I am going to be the next Serena Williams. So after watching this game, I decided to really get a bit more dedicated in my tennis career. So I started practicing every day, and I told my parents to try and buy me new things to help me be a better tennis player. And I actually got much better at tennis from watching Serena, and ultimately I ended up being the captain of my tennis team. Of course, I didn't end up going to Wimbledon, but that's my parents' fault because they didn't really invest in my talent. They couldn't see it for what it was, so that's on them. But absolutely, the main reason why I got into tennis was because of having this experience of watching Serena play tennis. So there are three main things that I think this idea of transcendence can teach us about the power of representation and why it matters not only in sports, because of course this is not a sporting conference, this is a tech conference, a PyCon conference specifically. And I'll go ahead and share some of those things with you this morning. So the first thing that I think this teaches us, or the power of representation and transcendence teaches us, is about inclusion. So I think when we are thinking about inclusion, one quote that I really like is by a lady called Mary Ann Wright Altman, and she says, "You cannot become what you cannot see." And I think it's very hard. It might be possible. I gave this talk once, and I was like, oh, it's not possible to become what you can't see. And some guy came, and he was like, it's possible, because I became a computer scientist, and I had never seen someone who was a computer scientist. So it's very hard. It's possible, but it's very hard to become something that you actually can't see. So for me, for example, it would have been very difficult to think to myself, I'm going to go to Wimbledon, I'm going to be this amazing tennis player, if I'd never seen someone playing tennis. And I think it's even harder to imagine yourself as well if there's no one that represents you or looks like you playing that game. So one example that we can think about is ice hockey. Has anyone heard about ice hockey before? Do we know what this is? Ice hockey is like a game where you play hockey on the ice. And for me, I never knew about ice hockey. I grew up in Zimbabwe. We don't have snow. We don't have an ice rink. And then one day I actually ran into some Canadians, and they were talking about ice hockey, and they were very passionate about this. And I remember just being there and being like, I really can't relate to you at all, because I've never seen this game being played before. And so for me, in general, I didn't even looking at the ice hockey players today and seeing what they look like, I'm just like, I really don't belong there. Ice hockey is not for me. And so when we think about representation and when we think about inclusion, one of the major things that I think is important is to represent different demographics, whether that's women or different races or different spheres, which I'm going to talk about just now. So I think it's important that we have people who represent different groups in positions that are visible and in positions of leadership as well. So we have representation at all levels. So one of the things that I think when we bring this back to the world of technology, when I think of the companies that represent, doing tech at the highest level possible, one of the companies that comes into my mind is Google. And I know, people have mixed feelings about Google, but it's a very big company. It has 190,000 employees around the world. And I decided, for me, usually when I am thinking about sort of representation and inclusion, because I am a Black person and I'm also a woman, those are specific things that feel important to me or that feel relevant to me. So something that Google has been doing since 2014 is publishing an annual report about their company demographics. And even more recently, they published this report, or the data for this report, on Google BigQuery through their public datasets platform. And honestly, kudos to Google for doing this. Like, I wish more companies would do that. Now, for me, I wanted to imagine, and let's imagine in this room right now, that you are all Marlene, and you're this amazing Pythonista from Zimbabwe who's involved in all of these things. And we want to find out, as Marlene, do you see yourself represented at Google? Can you go to Google or apply to Google and feel that you belong at Google? So to be able to understand this, let's take a quick look at some code. I am going to hopefully drag my other screen. Let's try and drag this out. Oh, it's on that side. Let's drag this to the side. And we are going to drag my code editor here. So I have a copy of this notebook because I'm going to try to run the code for us step by step. But running code in a live demo session is always, precarious. And so it might not work. So if it does, we will switch over to the copy version of this notebook. So what we're going to do first, we are using a library called IBIS. And we're connecting to the BigQuery database. We're specifically connecting to the Google DNI dataset that's hosted there. So they have a number of different tables in this dataset. And, oh, I wonder if we can, OK, it's moving, but at a very slow pace. Oh, it's moving? OK, great. So let me go to the side here and try and see if I try to do anything with code in real time. It's wild. But anyway, they have all of these tables that are there in the database. And sorry, it's taking a long time to respond. OK, there we go. So anyway, here's the code, the piece of code that I want you to see. The first thing I'm going to do is run this table, and so that we can get a look at some of the data that's available in the data set. So they have a workforce column that lets you know specifically which role that someone plays in Google. So whether they work in tech, they also have leadership data. They have data about hiring. They have data, different data. So this is a very interesting data set. They have the report here whenever this information was collected. Then they group the employees by race, and they also group them by gender. So I specifically use this table because it also includes the gender demographics as well globally. So we're looking for here. I am running a query. And I'm doing group by, and I'm taking the report year, I'm taking the workforce and the gender of women globally. I'm also taking the race, and I'm making the year 2023. So I'm doing a bunch of things, and I'm also making the different columns into a percentage. So we can see the data there. So when we look at the data here, we can see the number of women that are working in Google. So we're specifically getting the gender. We're isolating women in the company globally. So this is actually pretty good. In non-tech roles, they have 53% of Google's non-tech roles are women. 32% are leaders. I'm not sure what the tech old thing represents, but in tech specifically, 25% of their workforce is women globally. And then when we isolate this and bring this down and we say, okay, what part of this workforce is black? When we look at the women, the people in tech that are black, we have 4% of that group being black. And then now if we aggregate everything together and we say we want to get the percentage of women and we want to get the percentage of black women specifically, we get 1% of the people working globally in Google are black women working in tech. And we can visualize this over time as well. So I'm going to try and run this cell here with matplotlib to visualize that data. And yes, it worked. So we can see that over time, this has gradually been increasing in terms of the percentage of women globally that are working in tech specifically at Google. And that percentage of women is about 1%. I actually have the actual image here in my slides. So we're going to go back to the slides where it's a bit safer. And I don't know how to minimize this now. How do we minimize it? You see, if you do anything with code, swipe to the side. Anyway, I'm going to try and put this one over here. But I think the point of what I was saying is that it's very, very unlikely. It's actually quite unlikely for you to meet a woman working in tech at Google. Actually, there's like a 1% chance that a woman working at tech at Google will be black. And this is globally across all of their offices. So we can see, this is the graph that I created from their data. And we can see over time, it's actually quite shocking. In 2014, they had almost no black women globally working for their company. That number has increased slightly, and it's at 1% now, slightly over 1%. So we have about 1,000 employees that are black women working in tech roles at Google at the moment. And this is not specifically a criticism at Google itself, because I think they're taking steps and trying, with the minimal few resources that they have, they're trying the best that they can. So, So I also want to mention that I don't think this subject of inclusion or representation is just about gender and race. I think it goes beyond that. Oftentimes when we talk about diversity, we think about demographics. And some people might be thinking, oh, how can I get more black people to attend my conference? Or how can I get more women to be part of my meetup? But I love this quote. I'm not really sure who said it initially, but it says, diversity is about demographics. Inclusion is about a sense of belonging. And we need to feel like we can belong wherever we go. And I think one of the things that makes us special as human beings, I'm not sure if animals do this, but I probably don't think they do. But as human beings, one of the things I think that makes us special is that we have shared experiences. So we can relate to each other's experiences, regardless of your race, regardless of which country that you come from, and regardless of your gender. So in tech specifically, I think there's several ways that even if you don't look like someone else or you're not an underrepresented group, you can actually represent a large group of people in ways that someone can look at you and they can see themselves reflected in you. So let's talk about those things. I think the first thing I want to talk about is shared experiences and the process of learning something new. So hopefully everyone, let's lift up our hands if we've learned something new before. And we've been a beginner before. So I remember a few years ago when I first joined, so before I worked at Voltron, I was at NVIDIA. And when I first joined NVIDIA, I was so scared. And I remember even just setting up my laptop and my work environment. I was still getting used to using NVIDIA GPUs. And I felt so nervous that even just the beginning steps, I was really taking so much time to do it because I was overthinking. And one of the main things that helped me was a senior software engineer on my team. I think when I was starting out, he saw that I was feeling nervous, and he just reached out to me, and he was just like, hey, I can see that you're nervous. Don't worry. We can go ahead and we can walk through the setup to set everything up. And he also shared that, when I first started, I also didn't really feel confident in what I was doing. But don't worry, you'll get there. You're going to learn, and you will grow. And so even though this was someone who was a senior software engineer, and he was someone that I physically, we look completely different. He's from a completely different country as well. I could see myself in him, and I could see, this person represents me in terms of if they started out not knowing exactly how to do this, and right now the senior software engineer who's really great at their job, then I can get there too. There's a path for me. So I think telling your story and sharing when you're learning something new or you're seeing other people learning something new is really important. And I think 2 practical ways that we can do this in the Python space is to share your story with other people. So whether that's tweeting, whether that's with your own team, if you want to give a talk, but just being open with where you've struggled in the past. I think sometimes we can fall into this space where we want to look like we're super competent, and it's important to look competent in what we do, but sometimes sharing that, hey, I made this mistake this number of times or something else makes people feel like they can also try and make mistakes too. Another thing is good documentation. So when you're writing your code, remember that what it felt like to go over this code when you first used it. So sometimes I think it can be challenging if you're starting out with a code base and the documentation isn't great. And if you're intentional about thinking about the people that you're representing, the people that are going to have the same struggles as you in the future, and keeping that in mind when you're writing good documentation, I think is another way that we can do that. So the second thing that I think we can learn from Transcendence is inspiration. So now that if we see ourselves being represented, I think we start to feel like we're included. And if we feel included, what happens is we have people coming into the space that don't look the same or don't have the same background. And I think this creates a very unique environment that can lead to all sorts of inspiration and creativity as a direct result of the diversity in the room. So one example that I like to talk about recently is this man. His name, I didn't write it on the screen, but his name is Pat Hanrahan. And Pat Hanrahan is the creator, he's the founder of Tableau software. He actually sold Tableau to Salesforce for like $16 billion. So he did great. And he's won 3 Academy Awards. So that's not something software engineers do every day. And he's also a professor at Stanford. And I was at a conference where Pat was giving a talk. And when he gave this talk, he was speaking about innovation and creativity and how they've played a very big role in his career. And in the talk, he shared that some years ago, he was working for Pixar on some rendering software. And he was trying to figure out how to represent light reflecting on skin using this rendering software. And a lot of his friends at the time were artists. So he went to lots of spaces where artists hang out, and they would always have conversations about different people that they enjoyed. And so by virtue of hanging around artists, he got interested in art himself. And so he found a Dutch artist called Rembrandt and became very interested in this artist. And it was in studying Rembrandt that he found a technique in oil painting called impasto. And this technique actually gave him a deeper understanding of how light interacts with translucent surfaces. So I'll quote him directly from the talk, and he says, artists, they sort of instinctively figured it out. They don't know about the physics of light transport. Inspired by this whole idea of Rembrandt's, I came up with a mathematical model. And it was actually from this model that he went on to create this rendering technique that was used in Pixar films like Toy Story and Finding Nemo that he went on to win Academy Awards for. So that's one example, I think, of having a diverse community around you that actually leads to more innovation. So for me, I think having a welcoming community means we have a greater capacity to be creative. Anwesha gave a great talk yesterday about her journey coming into tech as a lawyer. And I can only imagine, she shared about her experience being very negative and people telling her, no, you can't do that. Or, I've seen in tech spaces where people will look at a marketing person and be like, why are you here at this conference? Or like, there's this attitude that people have sometimes. And I can only imagine a Python community where you aren't told you shouldn't be here, but you're actually welcome. You're told you're welcome, your skills are valuable, and your perspective adds to the community. So what would the most inclusive version of our community actually look like? Now, finally, I want to end by talking about why you matter and why the value of your story is important as well. So 100 years ago, I'm joking, like 6 years ago, I was here at PyCon Italia as well, and I was giving a talk, and it was the first talk that I had given outside of Africa. And I remember just really loving the conference so much. I had been so nervous to come and speak. And Matteo, I don't know where Matteo, and I don't know if people know Matteo, but Matteo is amazing. I don't know who he is, but everyone give a hand for Matteo. He is like one of the kindest people I have ever met, and he helped me when I was feeling super insecure and I was, nervous about my talk, and I was this random girl from Zimbabwe at this Italian conference, and he was just super encouraging to me. And that's something I really remembered from that conference. And something else that I remembered was a keynote that a lady called Valeria gave that was right on this stage. And at the time, this stage looked huge. And I remember looking at her and thinking, oh my gosh, she is so awesome. And I hope to be like her one day. And so for me, this moment and the PyCon Italia team inviting me to give this talk is such a full circle moment for me. Because I was able to see like someone else's story reflected back in my own, and now that's actually come to pass, and I'm giving a keynote today. This is kind of cool. So another person that I will say is a great inspiration in terms of representation is Guido van Rossum. And I thought he would recognize me this year at PyCon. I went to PyCon US this year, and he was like, sorry, do I know you? But a few years after PyCon Italia, I went to PyCon US, and I met Guido. And he is the creator of Python, if you don't recognize him. But I remember that when I went to this conference, he was wearing a shirt that says, Python is for girls. And I loved that shirt. And I think one of the reasons the Python community is growing as fast as it's growing and is as inclusive and welcoming as it is that Guido himself, even though he doesn't do it perfectly, he's actively making an effort to make the community welcoming to people who look different from him. And then finally, I will mention these three women on the screen. Rebecca Anchanong, Johanna Nandeke, Anna Makarite. These are incredible African women that are leading in the tech space. Rebecca has founded a company that is making millions of dollars in Africa, a tech company. She's super inspirational. Joanna is a Python core developer. She works for IBM. She's a PSF board director right now. Anna Makarite she was the previous, actually, president of the Django Software Foundation, and she's one of the founders of Python Zimbabwe. So these are all women that I think as well, it would be awesome if you could give them a follow or encourage them or see yourself reflected in them as well. So yeah, I'm actually going to end there, and thank you so much for listening to my talk.
Thank you so very much for the talk. We do have one question. Please keep them coming. Talking about mistakes, what has been your biggest in a tech role?
Great question. Wow. What's been my biggest mistake? I think I was, I'm trying to remember what was, it didn't actually lead to anything, but I remember when I was first contributing to QDF, which is one of the projects that I was working on at NVIDIA. I messed up this thing. Like we have, so it's an open source project, and you're supposed to like do some specific checks and things like that. So I mixed up the checks and ultimately like uploaded the code, but the code didn't get merged. But it was, to me, it felt like a big mistake at the time. It wasn't that big because the code didn't get merged. So I feel like that's one. I'm trying to think if I have any other ones. No, I'm just a perfect person, so that's it. That's the only one I'm thinking of right now that's relevant to tech, yeah.
Is anyone here having a question I can sort of bring you one? Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering, as a group organizer, what was your biggest challenges? And especially if you can share some tips on maintaining the people on the groups. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Oh, I will also say that maybe a mistake that I've made is like I've obviously applied for lots of different roles and not gotten the job, so that's probably one. But in terms of that, community organizing, it's really hard. And the thing that I feel is the most helpful for me is keeping relationships with community organizers. So I'm particularly involved in the Python Africa community. So if I'm trying to organize something for the wider community, I'll like reach out to local organizers. If you're organizing a more local event, I think that is a bit harder. I think one of the things that is helpful for that is like consistency. For me, the meetups that I tend to attend the most are the ones that I know, oh, it's going to happen, you know, once a month on a Thursday, you know, at this time or whatever. That consistency, I think, makes a big difference. So, yeah, I'm not great at that either. So,
there's another question for you, saying, what has been the most challenging thing working on empowering girls to start coding in Zimbabwe, and how did you deal with that?
yeah, it's something that I've really struggled with because Zimbabwe is like a specific case, and it's really hard to get funding into Zimbabwe because it's a sanctioned country. There's lots of things happening with it. And so financially, for a while, I was like trying to run this nonprofit by myself, and I was trying to do everything. And I used a lot of my parents' money, and I'm sorry to them for that, but it's a good cause, so it's fine. But I feel like for me, trying to run it sustainably is something I've really struggled with, and I took a break from it because of the sustainability aspect until I could figure out a sustainable way to run the organization. So, yeah.
Yeah, we can all sympathize that. I do have a very, oh, sorry, yeah.
Can you elaborate on the Google DI report that you quoted? There's a distinction in there between so-called tech and non-tech roles.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on A, how those were defined in the report, and can you share your take on that perceived dichotomy between classifying roles as tech and classifying roles as non-tech?
That is a really cool catch, actually, because I didn't think about that. And I actually didn't, in the, specifically in the Google D&I data itself, it doesn't give a clear distinction between the two. I think for myself, I also didn't like go researching deeper into it because I just thought, oh, it's just non-tech and tech, so it's fine. But it actually links to what I was saying about people not feeling welcome because they're being told you're non-tech. So I think that's a great question, and I need to actually research that, and I will probably do that a bit different if I give this talk again. But I'm sure it's probably a breakdown between people who are software engineers and probably people who are not. And yeah, that's not always great. So,
yeah. There's another one very interesting, and thank you very much everyone for keep them coming. How can one attract diverse people in their company, given that there are fewer black women working or studying in tech in the first place?
So like I mentioned, I don't think diversity and inclusion is just about race and gender. I give that example because it's more relevant to me in my own life. But like, I'm not going to come to Italy where I don't know how many black people are in Italy and like expect there to be as many people working that are black in tech as they are in Zimbabwe. Like, Zimbabwe is full of black people, so it's going to have more black people in tech. But I think that being intentional, if you do have underrepresented minorities in any aspect, so be it people from a different background or from a different gender, even from a different perspective, in some ways, I think making those spaces intentional is really important, like intentionally safe, so really being aware of the language that you use around people, trying to be a bit thoughtful about it. I also think that I do think there's a pipeline problem. I do think that we need to be empowering more people with the right education. So I think that we need more education in underrepresented groups. Carlton gave a great example that in open source, like how are we going to know how people from underrepresented groups know that they can get experience through open source if it's all white males in open source? And like probably their friends are white males and their children are white, they're not white males, but white people in general. So I think that is also an issue in terms of, can we, as people who are different, think about someone who's different from us and think, how do I create space for them to have these tools to learn more about open source or software or whatever? But it's a hard problem. It's not an easy problem.
Sure. Do you have suggestions in setting metrics for impact for a national group?
For a national group,
National group.
I do not. I think I am not an expert in this field. So I primarily read on diversity and inclusion because it interests me. I also think that it's relevant to my life, so I'm interested in it in that aspect. What I do think is the metrics are important, and I think what Google has done is actually very good. The fact that they've actually openly shared their data across, openly, is something that not all companies are doing. How to collect those metrics or how to measure them nationwide, I'm not really a statistician. Like I can't make a good recommendation, I will say. So.
There's another one which is, I guess, quite personal, but as well as inspiring, is how do you manage your time and priorities among different roles and initiatives?
I could probably do a better job at that, honestly. Like, I'm trying to do fewer things now, and I'm trying to not overcommit myself. I think also when you're interested in these topics, like I don't know how many D&I councils I've been invited to join, and I'm like, I'm not joining any more D&I councils, But I think it's really important work. So it feels important to me, so I try to keep time for it. But if I don't have time, if I'm doing other things, I'll just say, I'm sorry, I just don't have the time, or I can't make it this meeting this week, or whatever it is.
Learning to say no is always difficult, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Learning to say no is hard. So.
I do have another question if anyone else has one. That was very selfish of me. Okay, got it.
It's a bit difficult. Why are we different? I mean, I'm a male, you're a female, I'm black, I'm white, you're black, etc. But does that make us different? So maybe not, because our passion, our interests make us more equal than what we see make us different. So the question is, how do you identify a different person from you? Because I don't consider you different. No, we share the same interest. So if I was to hire you or anything, I'm not going to look at you because you belong to a certain group, but because you express certain interests. So how do I know that I need different people? How can I understand that they are different and then they can bring value to me, seeing the world as in a way different than I do?
Great. No, that's a great question. Honestly, I think that humans have a lot of similarities. I think we all have shared experiences. I think we all love Python. Like, I am similar to you. I love Python, you know. I'm assuming you do too because you're here at this conference. So I think we have a lot of similarities, but I do think there are clear differences in terms of like, so for example, access, right? I did not know about computer science in the sense that I could code until much, much later in life. So I switched careers. I was in like molecular biology, pre-medicine route for a while. And I actually know there are people in my community that will not have access to a computer, right? And so this is a different person because of the access they have, the resources they have. And so even if they're going to come in and they're going to come in as a software engineer in your company, they might feel less confident than someone who has been coding from the womb, you know. Like I see Pi here, Anwisha's daughter, and I'm like, she's gonna be so confident as a software engineer because she's been around code her whole life. But for someone who's like new to it, it can be hard for them. So the experience, though we are doing the same thing, our experience and our perspective coming into it is different. So I think that makes a big difference. So I wouldn't say that you should, this is why I actually think that all software engineers should like look into like good emotional intelligence books and things like that, because I wouldn't say you should go and you should, if you see a black person, you should treat them really extra nice or like really different or something like that. It's like, oh, that would be bad as well. But like, I think you should try to be sensitive or use emotional intelligence to see if you see someone who's struggling, just like identify that and then approach them in a way that you think you would like to be approached in their situation. So maybe do some research on their background or something like that. But like, I wouldn't say you have to initiate that until you see that the person actually struggling with something. So I would say just trying to use like your own instincts, your own emotional intelligence about it might be a good way. But yeah, it's also hard. That answered the question well. I don't know if that answered the question well, but you can also chat to me afterwards if you'd like. Yeah.
So, anyone has any other question? Brilliant.
So, thank you for the talk. So, I currently work in finance, and finance is not a very diverse field, and especially, as you said, it's not just gender and color. It's also socioeconomic background. These companies and over in the industry, they like they identify talent usually based on school, and like the very elite school are not very diverse as a starting point. So it's a bit of an open question, but what do you think could like help them identify other talent pools, more diverse talent pools? Because like, yeah, they just want the very best, but like it happens that the only place they know how to find the best people are not very diverse. So I don't like, I think like there are certainly good schools in Zimbabwe, but like they don't know about them, and like they probably don't see them to the same level as European schools, and like we could say like, yeah, we could just like get more diverse people into the elite schools, but that's not an easy problem either. So yeah, would just like to hear your thoughts about like how to help with that.
Yeah, I think that's a hard question. I think particularly in finance, I'm not really sure how I would address that. I think in general, with education, it's a really big barrier for people. And that's why like initially when I started Zimbabwe, I was trying to get like a specific type of skill set in the girls we were teaching at a super young age, like before high school, so that they're building that skill set up until they're done. So my suggestion would be maybe to work with communities directly and look for communities that companies can partner with to, you know, you can really teach some of these skill sets to people at a younger age. So maybe doing after-school programs. There's awesome programs around the world, like Girls Who Code is global, a great program. There's a bunch of programs in Africa as well that do things like that. So I would say partnering with those communities that are already doing things, getting the education, if there's like a specific thing that they're like, we want this specific education set or skill set, trying to, I think, provide that at an earlier stage. But it's very difficult. It's a very, I'm not a super expert on what actually works, so I don't know. But yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Just dropped my phone, yeah. I have a question. I've been trying to get my two girls into IT for actually quite a long time now. And I'm not very successful at it. I was wondering, how can we make IT more interesting for girls? I mean, in terms of, not so much in getting them included, but actually, creating interest that comes from themselves.
Yeah. I love that question. I think that making programming interesting. So hardware is a big part of that. I love Adafruit's hardware. Adafruit has some amazing hardware that has lights and colors and these things, and I feel like the way we approach the interest, so not only just being because I think the problem is as well, one of the issues for especially for older girls in high school, I found is the image they have in their mind of what a programmer looks like, and they're thinking of a TV show where it's someone in a hoodie and they're in the dark somewhere. But I think for young girls, I think really the storytelling, I think is a big part of that. How do you get them interested in building a game in a fairyland somewhere that once they do get to certain places, a light lights up or something like that. I don't know, but I think there are some awesome resources. Adafruit has some great resources that try to do that, try to do some good storytelling. I think that would be my biggest suggestion, I would say. Yeah.
There's another one actually asking you, are you optimistic about the development of IT industry in Africa? Which are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities?
I'm optimistic. I am also a little tired, so I feel like I'm jaded a little bit because of how long I've been in the industry in Africa. But I am optimistic. I think there's huge opportunities in fintech. Nigeria has had several unicorns out of the country, in the past few years alone. There's been a number of fintech unicorns. So fintech is a big one. I would also say agriculture, agri-tech is a big one as well. There are a bunch of unicorn companies around agri-tech in Africa as well. I think access to internet is a big thing as well. I was talking to yesterday, no, a few days ago, and we were talking about the price of the internet. And in Zimbabwe, I'm paying $130 a month for internet, and he is paying in Switzerland $40 a month or $60 a month or something. And I'm just what are we doing? Why am I paying $130 for my internet connection? So also, can we get someone to provide internet at a reasonable cost to Zimbabweans or to anyone across Africa? That's one thing that I also think is something that I've consistently heard over and over again is the internet is too expensive, internet is too expensive. So we have a lot of Africa that is not connected to the internet because of the price range. It's too expensive. So that's a big issue, I would say. But I'm optimistic. I'm very optimistic about it. Hopefully some things will change soon. Yeah.
Brilliant. I guess we have time for just last question, and I will be selfishly ask you mine,
Okay.
which is, so from yesterday's keynote, from Vesha's keynote, we said, I come from the language, I stayed for the community. We've been talking about diversity, inclusion, what's the difference, and how healthy is the Python community. But my question is actually, where do you think the Python community can improve at the moment?
Yeah, I love the Python community. I think that we are doing a lot of things right. I think I would love to see inclusion in terms of other backgrounds, like I said. I think not just an emphasis on like, the demographic data, but also like, okay, where are people coming from? Like, I'd love to see more artists in this space. Like, I'd love an open space for artists, or I'd love to see like an open space for musicians. AI is actually moving us into that direction where, some of the most successful software engineers are the most creative ones. So I would love to see more inclusion of people from different backgrounds. Yeah.
I love that very much. Thank you. Well, with that, I think we do have time for a very quick last question, if you have one. Don't see anyone on Slido. Yeah.
Oh, there is one.
So thank you very much for the talk. You showed, large corporations like Google can afford to invest resources in diversity and inclusion programs and can rely on aggregate statistics to understand if they're going towards the right directions. Smaller companies, small businesses, cannot really afford to take this approach. So I'm wondering if you can share some practical tips for small businesses to improve their inclusion. And I'm not talking just about gender and race, if you call that, but I'm talking about inclusion in a broader sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great question. And I do think that, education, ideally, is something that is a great place to start. So maybe teaching yourself or about ways to make your company more inclusive. So it can be inclusion in terms of like, how do we create a workspace where people feel free to fail, Like creativity, just feeling like you don't have to be perfect, I think it makes an inclusive environment. So I feel like, maybe reading on that and presenting those. I think also as like a leader in your company or something, just being intentional about your hiring practices, being intentional about, even we talk about women who are mothers, right? And having inclusive policies for maternal leave. So can women actually have a baby and come back to work? That's something that in some countries is not possible. And so I think thinking about those policies on just trying your best for the people you have and seeing, okay, what do they need? And seeing yourself like in their shoes and trying to do the best for the people in your company, I think is a good start, I think. So, yeah.
Brilliant. I think we're at time. So, Marlene, thank you so very much.